And this presentation is 9/11 and our political crisis. And the political crisis is that in this election year, we are not given the option to exit from the war on terror. We've been in the war on terror now for 15 years. Some people will scratch their heads and say, what war is he talking about? But the war on terror has been going on for 15 years, and it's costing the American taxpayers something like $300 million every day of every week of every year that it goes on. So the long title of this presentation would be Ending the Dual Deception of 9/11 and the Global War on Terror. These are the first 14 speaking events, and then I'll be going back to New York in September. This is from the first tour that I did last winter, Solving 9/11 Ends the War. But as I said, a lot of people don't understand what war we're talking about. There are so many of them. I'm the author of Solving 9/11, The Deception That Changed the World. That's this book. This book is my analysis of 9/11, what it was all about, mainly how it's unique in the literature about 9/11 is I talk about who did it, who set it up, and why they did it. And the material in the little book is based on all the original articles that I wrote, the research articles that I wrote. And in this book, they're presented. This is Solving 9/11, the original articles. All the articles are presented from September 2001 through April 2012 when the book was printed. And then, as a little bonus, my wife and I wrote a little book for children. This is the ABC Zoo book, and we offer this book as well to help raise funds for the tour. But this is a book for the littlest children. It's got a clever rhyme for each letter, an illustrated capital, and then a vibrant watercolor. My background, my credentials are that I was an investigative journalist working in Washington, D.C. when 9/11 happened. And as fate had it, we were passing through New York City early in the morning on 9/11, just a few hours before it all happened. And before I worked as an investigative journalist, I worked for IBM, but I went to school at University of California in Davis and Santa Cruz, and I got my degree in history, with Middle East being my region, my specialty, and in particular, my focus was on Israel and Palestine. And prior to all that, I grew up in Schaumburg, Illinois, where I was an Eagle Scout and recipient of the God and Country Award. So the question is, why is 9/11 truth so important now, 15 years later? A lot of people will say, well, that was a long time ago, it was 15 years ago, it's all over, they're dead, they're buried, and Osama bin Laden's been killed. So what difference does it make? Well, it's very much like the 9/11, like the John F. Kennedy murder. Why does the murder of John F. Kennedy still matter today, 53 years later? Well, the murder of Kennedy matters because it was a coup d'etat. And the powers behind the assassination took control of the government and orchestrated the cover-up. The man raising his hand being one of the main cover-uppers. And a coup d'etat that is kept secret in a democratic country means that the succeeding government is illegitimate. U.S. military involvement in Vietnam spanned a period of 2 decades, from 55 to 75. But of course, it spiked after the murder of John F. Kennedy, because John F. Kennedy wanted to actually pull the troops out of Vietnam. The Kennedy assassination matters because the U.S. government continues to support the lies of the Warren Commission, mainly that one man did it, Lee Harvey Oswald, and that there was no conspiracy behind his actions. The Kennedy assassination matters because the mainstream media continues to support and even endorse the official version. The Kennedy assassination matters because when the government supports the lies about the murder of the president, it means that the powers that killed President Kennedy are still in charge to this very day. Of course, the American people have historically been of the opinion that there were others involved, that there was a conspiracy behind the murder of Kennedy. So, why does 9/11 truth matter? Here we are almost 15 years later. For all the same reasons, of course. 9/11 truth matters because the government continues to lie about what happened to this very day. These two men being of course, the administrations since 9/11. And 9/11 was a policy coup that brought us the war on terror and a series of costly wars. Actually, the war on terror brought us 9/11, but I'll get to that. 9/11 truth matters because for 15 years, the controlled media has pushed a false story, a false narrative about 9/11 and the war on terror, all the while suppressing evidence that disproves the official myth. The American people have, again, historically been of the opinion that the government has lied to them about 9/11. This is a poll done by New York Times and CBS, and they were asked if they thought that if the Bush administration had been telling the truth about 9/11. And in 2002, 3/4 of the population thought that the Bush administration was mostly lying or hiding something. And in 2004, it went up. In 2006, it went even higher. And when they found that only 16% of the population thought the administration was telling the truth, they stopped polling. This is our political predicament in a nutshell. If the government and media are lying to us about 9/11, it means that they, the government and the media, are controlled by the very people who carried out 9/11. Now, you can see that logically as a deduction, but that's a very serious state of affairs. So why did the government and media cover up the truth about what happened on 9/11? Well, for three basic reasons. One, to protect the real culprits from being identified. Two, to prevent the official myth from being exposed as a pack of lies. And three, to advance the fraudulent war on terror, the Zionist war agenda being waged by the United States, which was the primary reason for 9/11. Now, when I use the word Zionist, that's a political term. It's an ideology based on the concept of Jewish nationalism. So Israel is the Zionist state, and the ideology that the Jewish people should have a state only for themselves, and that is Zionism in a nutshell. Now, 9/11 was a highly sophisticated false flag terror atrocity designed to instill fear and rage in the population in order to compel U.S. public opinion to support the Israeli Zionist war agenda, known as the global war on terror. Now, starting the war on terror was the real reason for the false flag attacks of 9/11. Here is a sign from San Francisco, and the fraudulent war on terror is based on the myth of 9/11. Here's the Zionist connection. Here we see at the Pentagon in January 2002, you see the Israeli chief of staff, this is the Israeli senior military officer, meeting with the Zionist neocons, namely Paul Wolfowitz to his left, across the table, Rabbi Dov Zakheim, and to his right, Douglas Feith. These are three of the highest players in what they call the Defense Policy Board. These are the Zionist neocons. These men are Zionists. The three of them are Jewish, but they're Zionists. They're dedicated to protecting and serving the state of Israel. And he's the Israeli chief of staff, and they're meeting at the Pentagon. What were they talking about? They were talking about what the U.S. military response should be after 9/11. And as you see, the war on terror, of course, began about 3 weeks after 9/11. The Afghan people were completely puzzled. 85% of the Afghan people had no idea why the Americans were in their country. They never associated the American presence in their country with 9/11. Because they were not given that propaganda. They just saw, here's another invading army. The Afghanistan war is currently costing U.S. taxpayers $4 million per hour. Again, that's $96 million a day. And so that basically, within a good week, the United States spends more money in Afghanistan than they do on Amtrak, for example, for a whole year. This photograph is of the American military concentration camp in occupied Iraq. The camp was called Camp Bucca. It was named after a fire marshal from New York City who died on 9/11. And the American military tried to link 9/11 with the operation in Iraq, although there was, of course, no real connection. Yet at this concentration camp here, they were developing what became the leadership of ISIS. All of the leaders of ISIS, like Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, are graduates of this camp. The war on terror agenda was articulated by this general, Wesley Clark. In 2007, he was on the Amy Goodman show, and he spoke about this. And he said, about 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. One of the generals called me in. He said, sir, we've made the decision we're going to war with Iraq. We're going to war with Iraq, I said. Why? I don't know, he said. I came back a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing Afghanistan. I said, are we still going to war with Iraq? And he said, sir, it's much worse than that. We're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq, then Syria. Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off with Iran. As you can see, 5 of those countries have already been done. We have facilitated regime change in 5 of those countries and the division of those countries into parts. And that is the strategy that Israel has put forward since the 1980s to dominate the Middle East. It's called the Yinon Plan, named after the guy who wrote it, Oded Yinon. He's a strategist for the Likud party. And it was printed in a Hebrew magazine in 1982 called Kivunim. And thanks to an Israeli professor who thought that it was important for the non-Hebrew speaking world to understand, he translated this and it was published in America. And the Yinon Plan basically calls for breaking up the big Arab countries, the Middle Eastern countries, into statelets, ethnic statelets. And it's called Balkanization because it's exactly what was done in the Balkans, in Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was a large, secular, socialist country that in 1990s, when we invaded in NATO and bombed the heck out of the place, they broke it into like 7 statelets along its regional lines. So that's the plan. And as you can see, Iraq there has been now fragmented into 3 countries. Syria is in the process of being devastated in the same way. Libya is broken, Sudan is broken, etc. This is the name of the game. And they want to break these countries up along religious lines, confessional lines, or ethnic lines. So in Saudi Arabia or in Iraq, they broke it up into the Shiite area, which is in the south, the Sunni areas to the west, and the Kurdish areas in the north. And I wanted to point out that the Kurdish area in the north is where most American soldiers are currently serving today. And that is also the region where the Rothschilds own the oil. The Rothschild family owns the oil of Kurdistan. And you can see that this quotation at the bottom is from the Yinon Plan. And it's interesting, they point out that they want to break these areas up into these ethnic statelets, but at the bottom it says, the dissolution of the military power of these states is the primary short-term target. Basically, dissolving the military in these countries. And what was the first thing the United States did when it went into Iraq? Dissolve the military. Now, this is a very interesting email from Hillary Clinton in 2012 when she was Secretary of State. This is from a recently revealed WikiLeaks transcript. And Secretary of State Clinton wrote that the best way to help Israel is to use force in Syria to overthrow the government. And that email from 2012 reveals that U.S. policy to violently overthrow the Syrian government has been pursued by the United States in order to support Israel. Of course, overthrowing the government of Bashar al-Assad, and it's a government, it's an elected government that was elected in June of 2014, and it makes no sense for America to be overthrowing countries, in the Middle East. It is not serving any American interest whatsoever. But it is fulfilling that Yinon Plan that Israel has. And for Israel, the 2 main confrontational states were Iraq and Syria. And again, our new Secretary of State, the current one, John Kerry, when he spends all his time on Syria. And when he talks about Syria as if he is the one who's calling the shots. Here, this is from May 3rd of this year. This is a quotation what he said. He said, if Assad's strategy is to somehow think he's going to just carve out Aleppo and carve out a section of the country, I got news for you and for him. This war doesn't end. As long as Assad is there, in power, the opposition is not going to stop fighting him one way or the other. Now, this is not the words of a person who's observing the conflict, trying to resolve the conflict. These are the words of a man who is calling the shots. Now, the question is whether the war on terror is a war against terror or a war of terror. And what we can clearly see, it's the latter. Terrorism